Well, good morning and welcome to a very snowy South Wales. It's very snowy. This is the best we've had in years, actually. As you can see, I'm lightly injured, and by lightly I mean quite badly. I managed to completely bugger up one of my knees, moving stuff earlier in the week, and this is the furthest extent that I can get to, which is my garden. So I'm going to feed the birds because it's the start of March and it probably shouldn't be this snowy here. So, yeah, I'm going to do that, sit down, and then we're going to talk about the autofocus for birds on the Fujifilm X-H2S. As long as I don't fall over and hurt myself further. Yes, I can't. Oh, God. I can't necessarily recommend injuring your knee just before it snows. Although the snow's far from the worst part. If it gets icy, I'm going to be in quite a lot of trouble. Okay. It looks like it's vaguely working. So I've had the X-H2S for about 2 weeks now, and I took it to Slimbridge Wetlands Centre with my dad and spent a day effectively just trying to figure out the best autofocus setup for it. And by coincidence, as it turns out, I discovered when I got home, I ended up with the exact same birds in flight setup as Matthew Gasquet of Mirrorless Comparison. So his conclusions about the autofocus of this camera are still true, even on version 3 of the autofocus. With my leg being completely bollocksed at the moment, I'm just going to be standing up for this. I'm not entirely certain that many birds will come up and say hello to me, but the snow is quite thick, so maybe if I move back a little bit, they'll be a little bit more confident. Let's have a look. Okay. Put a few peanuts down and some fat balls out for them. So yes, with the X-H2S, I think there are 2 different autofocus setups that you need. You need one for birds in trees and bushes, and you need one for birds in flight when they're flying towards you. Which might sound like an odd distinction, but it's the one situation in which the default setup that I use doesn't work. And it really doesn't work. It has a lot of trouble. So for my default setup, which I use for birds in bushes or most of my photography, I'm not overly interested in birds flying horizontally anyway, so I don't have a dedicated setup for that. Using one or the other of these 2 setups kind of gives decent results for that. But the second setup is very specifically for birds flying directly at the camera, because it is one of the most challenging situations for a camera's autofocus, and if you use the object detection on the X-H2S, it cannot focus on them reliably. So let's go into it. So the X-H2S has 425 AF points, but what is not immediately obvious is that you can only activate all 425 AF points in single point AF mode. This took me half a day at Slimbridge to discover this, and it gives you a great benefit for birds that are smaller or birds that are in complicated surroundings. And the reason for this is that by default, if you use any of the wider zone areas or things like that on the camera, it uses the lower amount of 117, I think. 117 AF points. And the problem with this is that the AF points are quite large, and if you have it set to object detection mode, for example, when it focuses on the bird's eye, but the AF point covers more than the eye. It covers maybe a tiny bit of the background, and the bird moves rapidly, but not so rapidly that it immediately gets picked up by another AF point. So the large AF point that you had is now going to focus on the background. So you would find that it would be shifting to the background and coming back as the bird pops into another AF point. If you swap the AF point number to 425, you will find it much more accurate, and it does that far less. So for my default AF mode, I have focus area set to single point. You can use any size of that you want because you're going to be turning on object detection. I have AF mode set to all. I have the number of focus points set to 425. I have the AFC custom settings set to set 2, which is to ignore obstacles and continue tracking the object that it's focusing on. That means that it stays on the bird rather than focusing on twigs that go in front of it, and it does that very well. Very happy with that. And then setting object detection on. And so far, I'm very happy with these results. I have found this camera much more reliable in foliage than the OM1 is, because the OM1 doesn't give you that configurability of the AF. I found that it drifted towards foreground objects far too readily, and it wouldn't stay with the thing that you were trying to focus on. So overall, for birds in bushes, in trees, everywhere that isn't flying directly at you, very good, very happy with it. This is fantastic snow. So for birds in flight coming towards the camera, I would say that the X-H2S is not quite as good as the OM1. It was one of the peculiarities of the OM1 that it was so good in that situation, because it was so happy to swap to the foreground object. And it's a very fast camera, by all accounts. It will track, well, not even track, it will just keep shifting the focus back towards the front, which is why it gets confused by twigs. But for birds in flight coming towards the camera, it's very good, very effective. On this camera, if you turn on the object detection, it kind of struggles. It's quite strange. It sort of just forgets I'm being assaulted by this tree. It sort of just forgets that it was following anything at all, or it loses where it is, and it seems to want to go away from you to find the subject rather than knowing that it's coming towards the camera. So I have found that if you have object detection on, it very ably tracks birds that are flying parallel to you or away from you, but it does not follow them if they fly towards you. So I have a second custom mode set up for this, and the settings are identical to Matthew Gasquet's. I believe that they are the most reliable at the moment, and that is to use zone for AF mode. For your focus area to do a 7x7 grid, you are reduced to the 117 AF points. For AFC custom settings, I have it set to set 4 currently for suddenly appearing subject. This is because when it loses the subject, it jumps back to the foreground to try and find it. So that works quite effectively. And finally, I have object detection turned off. In terms of the reliability of this setup, I'm quite happy with it. I did a lot of testing at Slimbridge. I got some good results from this setup, although right at the end of the day, because it took me a lot of experimentation. And I've tried it at Forest Farm here in Cardiff more recently, and had good results with that as well. I found that it's remarkably good still at not getting tripped up by foreground objects and distractions like grass. It does seem to keep pulling focus back towards the front. I have this sequence I took at Forest Farm. There were some ducks taking off and flying towards me, mostly shot through grass, so there's a lot of blurry lines in front of things. But it did a pretty good job, and it tracked all of the different ducks at different times, depending on what one was currently moving, before finally sort of settling on the duck that was filling up most of the frame. So by the time that it's in the frame in a way that will make a nice photograph, it's doing a good job, and I'm pretty confident in it at that point. But for my purposes, these sorts of photos, as much as I love taking photos of birds flying towards the camera, don't make up the vast majority of my photography, because where I'm based, I photograph more small birds, and for small birds, getting anything flying towards you is not really something for autofocus usually anyway. It's usually something to set a preset distance with some bait to try and capture them. And so in that case, my default setup with the high number of AF points is working very well. And overall, for my use case, this camera is so far much more reliable and less frustrating for me. But that's going to vary for your use case. If you are primarily photographing birds in flight, I think the OM1 is a very capable camera for that purpose. When it comes to video AF on the X-H2S, for birds, I have found it superb. Really impressed with it. I much prefer it to the OM1 for videoing birds. I'll do more detailed stuff on that in the future, but from the shots I've taken so far, I find it very reliable, very sticky, and not very distracting. The movement of it is quite good, and I'm just very happy with it. When it comes to filming yourself with it, I will probably look at that a little bit more later on. I have got a small lens for the camera, but it's not a particularly good video lens. However, in my use of it so far, I've noticed that it's very good at staying on a subject, but the transition can be quite jarring. It's quite quick in how it's moving between focal distances. I think that can be fixed by adjusting it, so I'm going to try that a bit more. But that's something I'm going to have to experiment with to see how it compares to the Panasonic in particular. Although, considering that the S5 is probably just losing my face all the time during this video anyway, I'm not too fussed. Well, so far I think this is somewhat futile on account of... I've probably blown out the sky on this now. Yes, it's probably somewhat futile on account of it's snowing so heavily that the birds aren't out properly yet. There's a few small tits and things, but they're not hanging around because they're quite vulnerable in snow like this, and so they're proving quite challenging to get anything off. Nope, I'm giving up. None of the birds are really coming out, so hopefully the snow sticks around until I'm healed up somewhat and I can actually go wandering further afield. It won't, but you know, we can hope. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully my very brief details about my current autofocus settings for birds on the X-H2S are of some use to you. If you have any other ideas or suggestions, please do let me know. I'd be really interested in trying out other setups. I tried out quite a few, but surely I haven't tried out all of them. Until next time. I'll have one last wander and then I'm giving up.